Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of Singlehood Unlimited with Dr. Casey. I'm your host, Dr. Casey, and we will be talking about singlehood. We have plenty of content online about romance, love, and relationships, but nothing about singlehood, especially not a positive, affirming, and celebratory take on singlehood. This show brings to you for the first time in India a lively discussion about the joys and tribulations of being single. We have with us today Professor Roma Chatterji, retired professor of sociology and a 66-year-old never married woman. Welcome to the show, ma'am.
Thank you.
You are in some sense a role model now to kind of guide us younger single women and men. Uh, right. So to start with, how did the decision to become single come about? Like, what was your thought process? What were some of the influences?
It wasn't really a decision I had to take. So it wasn't an event in my life. I always knew that I did not wish to be married from ever since I can remember. And I suppose I was lucky enough not to have to face too much opposition in that. So it wasn't there wasn't a point in my life where I felt I had to take the decision. I always knew. Certain things you know about yourself.
Is there something specific, like is it a personality thing or what was it
I think
that
it's probably a personality thing. I do like to spend time alone. So that was important. I think there were enough people around me in my own family, my grandfather, who probably respected that. Not that I would discuss these things with others, but my grandfather, who I think he was also a scholar. And of course, he was married, though quite a few. He, for instance, I think would have been quite happy not married. Of course, for that generation of men, even if they were married, they could do their own thing, and which he always did. He always did because that sense of conjugality was very different then. You didn't have to be everything for each other, which frankly is very scary.
That
This
is
couple's
true.
idea.
That is true.
There are too many While that I think may have been tough, but I don't know. Everything is tough. So with my grandmother, she accepted him for what he was. I guess she also had no choice. So he did marry because it was obligatory. I think he was forced to marry. And he had a happy married life. I'm not saying that, but I think he quite understood the fact that there could be people who didn't wish to be married. And my father respected his father's decision, and he said so to my parents as well, that if I did not wish to be married, I should not be forced. See, by the time we grew up, it wasn't likely that I would be forced. I mean, I come from the kind of family where they're fairly liberal, which is unlike other women of my generation. But I have to say, I was privileged. So it was never an issue. It became a bit of an issue when I went for field work. I'm a sociologist. It was a fairly tough field. It was in Purulia, which at that time had been undergoing drought for 3 years. It was but it was a very rich place in other ways for the kinds of work I was working on, folklore, for instance. And I did fall very ill while I was there because of malnutrition, amongst other things, for a whole year. And I think relatives in Bengal, because obviously they got extremely worried, said you should go back, this is not for you, you should get married, etc. But I have to say it was never my parents, and I did go back to the field. That was also not an issue. That was not an issue. So yeah, and I mean, distant relatives you don't really have to pay much attention to. So and after that, I don't know whether my parents had to face a lot of questions. Maybe my father's quite eccentric, so they probably. But later on, I know my mother has told me she would offer neighbors and so on. We live in Delhi, so it was Chha. She said, बेटी बोलती है दूसरों के बर्तन क्यों माजे? हाँ, ये भी सही है. You know, people like that. You have all kinds of people in Delhi, so. And it is surely a question that people would ask. So what happened? Why not? Well, nothing much.
How did your parents handle that?
Well, I've just given you an example. I had no idea because it is not something that they would discuss with me, that they had problems in addressing other people's questions and so on. So they've never shared it with me. So I guess I've had it at easier time. I think my father has always been considered to be rather eccentric, so they probably wouldn't have asked him anyway. My mother, well, I guess she would have, for a long time at least, would have wanted a more conventional thing. But my brother's married, so I guess they have their grandchildren and so on. They both died recently, but that wasn't an issue. And I think later on, they saw that I was perfectly happy in my life and economically secure, and that wasn't going to be a problem. And I have a brother, so in the event of anything unfortunate, I mean, there are at least two of us.
What is interesting is that the brother fulfilled that desire. So
absolutely.
You
So
had
I
this
was
space.
free,
Yes.
and he also had. Well, academics is also a fairly conventional career, but see, we start our careers later because at least in my generation, jobs were really scarce, and you went from whatever you were doing the next, whether it was studies, you went to the next step, or I had a postdoctoral fellowship after my PhD for 5 years. And then I came back and I was lucky enough to get a job in the same university where I studied.
Where did you do your postdoc?
Oh, in the Netherlands. So straight after my PhD, or actually just after I submitted, I already had this offer. My former supervisor, Veena Das, she and I don't know if you've heard of him, Klaas van der Veen, who wrote a well-known book called I Give Thee My Daughter. It's on dowry and it's on marriage in this particular amongst the Annaval Brahmins of Gujarat. So at one time it was a very well-known book. There used to be this program called the Indo-Dutch Program for Alternatives in Development. This is before Schengen. So this is before the Erasmus Fellowship. This is 80s. We're talking about 1985. And there were it was a sort of exchange program. I think it was funded by the development agency. So there had been quite a few Dutch scholars, even sociologists, geographers, anthropologists, who had been working in India largely in Gujarat. They have a very strong Gujarat connect. Uh, Apart from some Indians going to do library work or conferences, there was nothing. So they put their heads together, and I think it was Veena Das's idea that we do need some people to do field work in the Netherlands. It's a very different kind of perspective, and also it would help us because while we teach comparative social all the time, most of our work is in India. All our ethnographic work is in India. So it would be good for us, Indian sociologists. It would be good for the Dutch. Another perspective on their society. I'm afraid that was a little difficult to convince. I guess because the funding came from a particular organization that felt that they were there for India's development. What could India learn from the Netherlands? So I remember the project report said, but maybe we could also teach you something. And death was the topic. Death is the underbelly of a developed society. I said, well, what do you do? And I think Klaas had something about that conception, though Veena Das herself, her first work, her PhD, which later became a well-known book, part of it was an analysis also of death ritual. Right, so she's always worked on death. She's had students who worked on death. So there, of course, it was more death ritual. But it was quite a long story, actually, getting to do field work in the Netherlands. So initially, because it was taking time, and they'd already earmarked whom they wanted. I mean, so it wasn't as if it was everyone applies and so on, because I think they needed to be confident who would do the field work and how, since it was going to be participant observation. So at least a minimum of a year, we would learn the language, etc. So it was taking a long time, and see, all three of us were about to finish PhDs. Right, so then we would have moved on. So, and the ICSSR got very excited, the Indian Council of Social Science Research, about this. I think there was one lady in particular who, with her Dutch counterpart, took it upon themselves, we have to get this through. So it was these are the way things happen. A lot of contingent factors. So the ICSSR decided to send us as exchange fellows. We learned the language for 3 months. Then they still said, but we need more time. So, okay, now class was furious. Class Vandefeld was furious. He kept going, what is this hypocrisy? Why are the Dutch so hypocritical? Etc. When it comes to studying outside, what is this nonsense? And you call yourself a democracy. So anyway, Veena Das at that point had gone to Amherst College in the US, right? So she was the loose professor of religion. So she said, why don't you come and stay with me? Why don't you do library work? And for me, since anyway, euthanasia at that point had become a big issue. Whether or not, so passive euthanasia was always there, even if sort of unacknowledged. But with, so there was quite a lot of writing around euthanasia. So I said, yeah, I mean, I'd like to look at that literature. While my our Dutch by 3 months was very good conversationally, writing was still difficult, reading was still difficult, and my writing is still terrible. So I went off, and another colleague, the third one, still hadn't finished his PhD, so he went off to Cambridge to finish. Why Cambridge and why not back to Delhi University? Don't ask me. Anyway, so we went, we were there for 2 months, and of course, we came back, still not finalized. Now, we sat then with the counterpart of the ICSSR person who was in charge of our programs in Europe. We sat with him, and overnight, the two of us, my colleagues Shobji Dr. Chaudhary and I, we reformulated the proposal to say aging. Because after all, there is a notion of social death. It may actually be more interesting. So we rewrote it. And we rewrote it in a matter of 2 hours. He put in the bureaucratic language. So we said, okay, these are the ideas. And I have to say, I don't know if it would happen now. But it happened then, and we were the first three. Right? So then I decided, I visited a few nursing homes because I was going to be the one working in the institution. There was one who decided he would work on chose a village because he hadn't done village studies for his PhD. He'd worked in a temple complex. So, village studies, he had to go to the Netherlands. And the other one was in an old age home. Now, there is also, I don't know whether I'm taking too long, but there is a notion of pillarization, verzuiling, in the Netherlands, which means even though all of these are government funded, all your educational institutions, your medical institutions, except newspapers, actually were organized into 3 streams depending on ideology or affiliation. So you had the secular humanists, the Catholics, and of course the Protestants. So I was in a Catholic home in Arnhem, which is towards the south, not exactly. One of us was in a very strictly Orthodox Calvinist village, where a lot of the Boers went to South Africa, the Afrikaners from that part. And the other was in the outskirts in a suburb of Amsterdam called Diemen, and he worked in a secular humanist old age home, which actually became quite important after the war. A lot of the left intellectuals followed that persuasion. A lot of the, especially because there are many more old women than men. Old women survive widowhood and other things. Men don't. Men don't. So a lot of these women actually participated in the movements that actually led to the building of the welfare state in the Netherlands. So it was quite interesting. In Arnhem is closer to whatever the Dutch still had, the remnants of aristocracy, because that was one of the, I think, the staging grounds for whatever aristocracy the Dutch once had. A lot of it was sort of still colonial. So you still had those, estates and so on. I mean, whatever is left. And I lived in an old age home, which was right next to the nursing home where I did my field work. What was fascinating that you met a generation of people whom the Netherlands would not see anymore, because they literally grew up as part of the elite, but also the intellectual elite. So this was the colonial administrators, the shipping families. And one of my best friends from whom I learned an enormous amount. We used to sit together in her sitting room. Her husband was a colonial administrator in Indonesia. So for some reason, she said, I can place you, because she seemed to say, and the others couldn't understand because they're not brought up with ideas of class.
True. True, I got
So
it.
you
Yeah.
understand.
Very
So it
different
sounds
shift.
terribly elitist, but it was what their nature was. And she loved finding out about things in her own society, which I would be telling her about every day. And it was amazing. So I met a generation of Dutch people who most Dutch people would not meet.
Wow.
I mean, you go into someone's sitting room and they all had service flats, so two large rooms, and of course their food came to them with care. And these were really old people, some of them suffering from early stages of dementia, but still very aware of their surroundings, wouldn't have been shifted to a nursing home or old age home. Right?
Yeah.
You go in and you see these 14th and 15th century polychrome sculptures. I just went in and said, Frau, where am I? And she was clearly very pleased, but she said modestly, my husband did not believe in banks. So the rest follows, right?
Yeah.
So it was fascinating.
Wow.
So other than the fact that I was working with demented people, so I learned an enormous amount, because Alzheimer's disease and the other forms of dementia were not understood in India at that point. Nobody knew.
Yeah, that time
At
it is
that point,
definitely
nobody
not.
knew anything.
Yeah.
So I think I was extremely fortunate. So I was there for 2 years for field work, came back. We spent a lot of time writing because it was very difficult. And then I managed to get a job in the school where I had studied, in the Department of Sociology at the Delhi School.
So when you started your work, and this is something that you've spoken about your parents. So what I find interesting is that we just were discussing Kalpana Sharma's edited volume, and this is a narrative that I've seen, that women who are never married always credit their parents, right? That support, parents are supportive. And I'm absolutely fascinated by that fact.
I guess I still wouldn't have, even if my parents were not supportive, because I guess I make up my mind very quickly. I know what I will be able to do, and I know what I will not be able to do. It's a personality trait.
Right.
I wouldn't have married anyway.
Right.
And I don't think I don't know how many parents would actually force you, unless they felt you were in uncertain.
I feel these days there's a lot more force. I don't know, maybe those days.
I think families are not that. At least I see that with some students, the ones who may be very bright, etc., but who seem to be emotionally very insecure. There's probably some complications in the family. And other than the fact, the joint family had huge problems. And my father was in the army, so I can't say we were exactly joint, but I spent a lot of my education happened staying with my grandparents, while my father was in non-family station, or they were in a small Mufassal town where the schools weren't great. So those kinds of things, I think I had that extended family. So, and of course, see, everyone had very strong personalities in my family, so they were not ideal relationships. So we saw all of the fights and everything, but I don't think there was any lack of stability in that. And those days, people didn't get divorced very easily. Some did.
True.
So in fact, there are two people who were school friends of my grandmother. Right? One of them divorced within 2 months of a marriage. The other one never got married. Would you believe it?
Wow.
Beena Roy was her name. She was very well known as an educationist.
Wow.
So I think she helped to set up the Women's Institute in Delhi and the one that runs a hostel for working women and so on.
Oh, wow.
I think her name was Roy, but I knew her all my life.
Wow.
And her sister.
Was she an influence, do you think?
See, I always thought of her as Beena Nani. So I have no idea. So I sort of knew that she had all of this, but nobody made a big deal out of it at home. In our family, nobody makes a big deal out of anything. So I guess I never thought of it as radical, because so she was there. Her younger sister, that we always felt was a bit funny. She was married for 2 months. And neither her nor her husband ever got married again. And so everyone found it very funny. And she was always the little sister. And she remained the little sister all her life. She was an archivist, huh? So can you imagine those days?
Wow.
So clearly she was, an independent woman working, but we always thought of her as Veena Nani's little sister, kind of. So yeah, they were fun things, but I think, yeah, there were enough educated women. My mother went to college, etc. She was married pretty early in life, but I think she always wanted to do, because she had a very strong personality. She chose to get married. Sure, her parents wanted, but she did want to get married, and I think, yeah, she did start working, but after my father retired. That is true. So I think there was always that part in her that also wanted a career, and probably
That
didn't
kind of
have
manifested in you.
confidence to
Yeah.
take it on.
Right.
So
But
those
once you started working and all,
Yeah.
what was how were you perceived, let's say, by your
Yeah.
colleagues, your friends,
See-
because your parents and family now will know.
Yeah. Now, again, I'm sorry, it sounds terribly smug and self-satisfied, but I can't help it. I studied in the same place where I got a job.
I see. I see.
Right. So now the point where really I began to see the dark side of being a single woman was when I stayed for 1 year in this. It is part of Delhi University, but a women's hostel, which is now meant for students. I mean, I never saw this when I actually lived in a women's hostel as a student.
Okay.
But then, and suddenly you see women, and they would have been 10. One of them, I remember, had even been a teacher in the psychology department in the college where I studied in Delhi. And suddenly I saw what it could be like for many women. It was frightening. And that was when I think I confronted it. See, because otherwise I got a job in the department where I had been a student from MA, PhD, etc. So it was I mean, like the teachers all knew me. I'd been the student. And there were others. So yeah, a person who's about a year and a half senior to me, also unmarried. Another man who was a Naxalite in his youth, Rabindra Ray. He has a well-known book, it's passed on, but called The Naxalites and the Ideology. He was unmarried. So I think maybe sociology is quite comfortable with eccentricity,
Yes.
So I think if it had been the though economics has had at least two women who are not married and several very strong women who were married but were known for themselves. Dharma Kumar being one. So it's not as if it was, see, Delhi, at least the university was reasonably cosmopolitan and certainly sociology was. So D school, again, you could say we were a bit sheltered, but and they were part of the same universities. Somebody from the English department, and the English department always felt, they were special.
Yes.
And this person in her youth as a young teacher was considered to be, extremely very bright, very fashionable, etc. Then I never knew her then, but then I wondered what happened. So there were these petty frustrations and horrible, but it sounded like something out of a Dickens novel. And it's horrible to say this, but it was scary. And of course, there were women, many who were younger than me were doing PhDs, but all of them had clearly trauma in their life. And some of these could seem fairly mild if you look at it from the outside, like an engagement gone wrong or an affair gone wrong. I mean, a marriage breaking up, it was worse. None of them had children. One, in fact, who was the most sensible, was a very young woman. She was doing her PhD. Her husband was murdered. But she was a very young woman. There was a lot of anger in her, but she went on to remarry and etc. And I think what was really even more frightening was the fact that here were these teachers, and some of these people were, taught people of my generation. They would look at her as if they were the mothers-in-law substitutes. Why is she going? I mean, she's a young woman. She was not even 30. I mean, she has to make her life again. She probably lost her husband within 2 years of marriage. Very attractive to look at, very bright. She was doing a PhD in Hindi. We had long conversations, and I would try and tell her, just ignore it. I guess because I was, again, from sociology, and we study other societies, right? So there were a lot of confidences from the younger people. So there, for the first time in my life, I saw what there, but for the grace of God go I. And
Yes.
it was frightening. Just before that, because this is after I came back from the Netherlands, and I was a research associate in the department, then I became a lecturer and so on. But in the Netherlands also, because see, I was working in a place where maybe it is the dark side of any society. You're coping with death, you're coping with grief. So think of what it does to the caregivers. So I worked with two of the social workers before shifting to the ward. So I had that experience. I would follow the doctor. So I was called an intern,
Right.
a stagiaire, so a trainee. And I remember some of the people who were in the profession, and it takes its toll on you because it's emotionally very draining, who had perhaps reached their 40s. See, I was between 30 and 32 when I left, 33. Say 10 years older than you, whose relationships had broken up. Already there are not that many people. And they were approaching the last of their childbearing years. And it was frightening because then I thought, I couldn't possibly live here because you have to be part of a couple to be happy. Just what you were saying,
Yes.
which is what's happening in India now.
Yes,
And I
yes.
find that I'm very sad to see that.
Yeah.
And maybe because, it was acceptable to be part of a group.
Yes.
It could be a group of friends,
Yes.
it could be while there. And I have told this to people when, as an actor, people would ask you, what do you think? So I said, yes, death is difficult everywhere, old age is difficult everywhere, and we will see what you're seeing. But what I didn't expect to see was this terrible insecurity when you are not part of a couple. So whether you're homosexual or heterosexual,
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Do you
So
see
then
that in
some of
India?
them would be, well, maybe now.
Yeah.
See, now I still deal with students whose life is ahead of them.
Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
And not in these schools so much. I saw that in this hostel, and it frightened the life out of me. So that I hope I.
No, I got the point.
Yeah. And of course, in the Netherlands, it was more scary because they were just 10 years older than me. So I said, will I become like that ever? Then I thought, no, never. And of course, some of the friends, that's where I said, no, personality is different.
Okay. Yeah. But what about your friends and friend circle and social network?
See,
in
I'm a
India?
bit of an introvert, but
see.
see, it isn't a problem because a lot of our friends, if I don't go for that many parties, but even if there is a they don't often come with their spouses. Sometimes they do.
Okay.
Then they get incorporated into the department culture. For the men, they even called by, see, women, a lot of women don't take on their husband's name. So poor Hari will be called Miss Dr. Chopra when he's a sen. Oh, हाँ Mr. Mukherjee आए थे नहीं Mr. Brana आए थे मैडम Mr. Brana is actually a Mukherjee. See, so हाँ मैंने उनको बोला आप क्लास ले रही हैं क्लास के बाद आप उनके कमरे में बैठ जाइए मैं खोल रहा हूँ कॉफी लाओ Mr. Brana, Mr. Chopra. See, it was okay. And I guess our generation of teachers, see, there would have been more men than women in their generation, though there were more women than men in my generation of teachers. That's sort of getting slightly evened out now. Very strong women, huh? So everyone was quite sort of knew that in our department there could be different forms of sociality. Let's put it this way.
I think that's important.
So I can't say, see, again, it sounds smart, but I really haven't had problems on this front.
Wow. No, that's amazing. And I think a couple of things that you pointed out. One is that new forms of sociality, but also eccentricity. And strong personalities. I think these are defining features of being single.
Looking at me because but
I understand.
I guess the other unmarried woman might have had a slightly more difficult time because she comes from a Marwari family.
Right.
So even though they're pretty liberal, but still.
Yeah.
And I think she would probably have had to assert herself, but she's very assertive.
What is her like?
Rajni Paljiwala, the one who's worked on.
Is she also single?
They are the other group of scholars who went to the Netherlands for field work. She is single. She worked on single parent. She works on gender issues and kinship. Yes, and she works on gender issues and kinship. I can give you her email.
Yes, we will be in touch. Yes.
So lovely. And she has very strong ideological leanings. So she is a leftist and very strong about her.
Wow.
But yeah. So there were already, there was Rajni, there was Rabindra Ray.
Right. What about, I mean, you did mention, but in terms of, let's say, government officers,
Yeah.
or, those, let's say, if you want to buy
There's,
insurance or taxer, is there any specific place in that sense that you found that, no, you had to
well, they'll have to say, okay, bache. So I said, nahi, unmarried.
Huh.
Oh, acha.
And that's it.
Huh.
Okay, that's not really much. That's something you can handle. But let's say if you had to, let's say, buy a car, buy a house,
Oh,
take a loan,
acha.
so
Now
you
I have
that.
never done any of those.
Oh, I see.
See, because I mean, I have a very small flat which my father left me in Somnihar. It's a one bedroom. I'm terrified of machinery of all kinds, so I don't have a car.
Ah, I see.
And I managed to live on my salary because all I do is buy books. So no one will give you a loan for that. So I guess, I've also led a very sheltered life. I tend to minimize my existence to whatever I'm comfortable with. And I'm not comfortable with a lot of things. So you could say again, it's been rather foolish. But I'm quite happy in that way.
No, I don't
So
think
the
it's
only challenges I take are in my work. I have to say I don't take any, I don't, I mean, I lead a very boring, risk-free life. So the only risks I've taken is for my work. Field work, yes. And all my fields have been very difficult fields, but then that I wanted to do. And you take whatever. So the only risks I've taken are regarding that, my work. And yes, I've taken very big risks. I worked on collective violence at a time when we were under surveillance. The Netherlands was emotionally very tough. I almost had a nervous breakdown. I had a nervous breakdown in my first field. But yeah, I mean, got over it and went back. So it wasn't a huge deal, but I did go back after a year of illness. And I have to say, people support. My supervisor was very worried, but she did say, either go back or drop out. There was no question. And she said later, I was very scared, but you did go back. So I guess somewhere you know what you have to do, and you know you're going to do it regardless. So yeah, so those risks, but in my life, otherwise I never take. I've always got what I wanted, so I don't need to also.
Yeah.
That's that.
But what have your living arrangements been like
Oh,
over the last
okay.
66 years? I mean, let's say post your job.
Yeah, so post the job, I told you as a research associate, for 1 year I stayed
That
in
hostel, yes.
It was a very good experience,
Yes.
but it was frightening.
Right.
Then I moved to a transit kind of place for younger teachers. Then I got my university accommodation.
Oh, so the university gave you accommodation as a single person?
No. No, you don't. Our university is not that politically correct.
Okay.
You got it in due course.
I see.
So I got it in due course.
Right. But they didn't ask you whether you're married or not, because that's something institutions
I mean,
do.
in Delhi, they probably won't ask you such questions. See, maybe in another place they would. Now, the places I've been to before I got my job, I was a student, and they will not ask you then. In fact, they will ask you, oh, you're a married student. How are you managing? How are you managing your studies?
Yeah, but as a professional.
And we don't have married hostels, quarters for. Maybe there are some in one of the old men's hostels, interestingly, but not in any of the women's hostels.
So then, as a professional, you were given in the course of time.
Like everyone else's. So I can't say
I was any different.
It was no different at all. Before that, then I lived in rented accommodation.
But was it alone or was it
alone? Because my parents, they had their own place in Delhi.
I see. So was it that because they had their own place in Delhi, you were there like, oh, why don't you live with us? Why are you living?
Well, I think when I wanted to stay, once after I got my job, I first stayed in rented in two different rented accommodations, one on my own, and before that, when we first got with another student, I mean, she was finishing a PhD, she didn't like the hostel anymore, so we shared. My father was a bit upset then because he felt, but so my mother explained that look, it's closer to the university, it's easier for her to work than if she was here. So then, of course, they insisted they had to set me up. So all the buttons and so on, and I don't cook still, but we managed. Okay. So yeah, that my father he was worried and he felt that he wasn't doing his duty, right, by his daughter. So that old-fashioned thing did come, but then my mother explained it. So that way I've been lucky that when one had some kind of, you know, doubt about my
Yeah,
existence,
with
the
the other
other one
person.
would be able to reassure them, and it happened with both.
So you've lived, that means a good 40 years maybe alone?
Yeah, yeah.
And how is that experience?
Actually, I'm fine because I don't do very much around the house.
Okay, okay.
So yeah, I'm used to it.
Right.
So it hasn't been a big issue. I don't socialize a lot because see in the department you're with people anyway.
Right.
So when I come home in the evening, I really like
your
being
own
on my own.
space. Yes, I understand.
Yeah, just for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is that, would you say that's one of the joys of being single? What are
Oh,
the joys?
absolutely. The joy, well, all kinds of joys.
Yeah.
One is that I think, and maybe that's also not such a good thing, you don't have to compromise. So much of marriage is about compromise. Also with living with someone else, but see, if it's just a friend and you're sharing a flat, at some point, they do their thing, and you adjust. I guess you can become quite selfish, and I guess I am.
How is that selfish?
I don't know, but it could seem because really you don't have to compromise on many issues. Obviously, you all have to compromise in your work life.
Yes, absolutely.
But for certain things, you do what you like.
Absolutely.
So
And why should we compromise?
and I feel that is a privilege,
Absolutely.
and I am very well aware that it is a privilege.
Yeah.
It's not something I would give up lightly.
Can you just tell us 2, 3 things of these things where you didn't have to compromise and you're like, yes, this is
Look,
what I
see,
enjoy.
for most of my life, see, like you've lived with other people always. So yeah, they get in my generation, and even before guests come, I mean, I've never had a single room, a bedroom for ages. Even when I first came back from the Netherlands, we had a very, because my father did not believe in taking loans. He said, whatever I can afford, we have our ancestral home. Of course, none of them got on with each other. So my father was the first one to run away from them, even before my mother. I mean, she would have tried as a good wife to adjust. So she's also a very strong personality. So it was very small. So it was my bed that I called my own space, which was also okay.
Right.
You manage. And in the field, after all, you're never alone in
that is true. That is true. So this is the place that you get of your own.
Yeah. So that was quite nice. I mean, even the bed was okay. I cannot complain. But see, there will be people coming, and there will be people coming to stay. That's part of whatever. I have to say, because I'm so inefficient, nobody really comes to stay with me. Again, there are advantages.
There are great advantages to that.
See, so there are a lot of people who are actually very good housewives, even though they're single. I'm not one of them.
I understand that.
Yeah. So see, but
yes, I understand that. Yeah. One last question.
Yeah.
What are actually two more. You mentioned that, right? For your grandfather's generation, the idea of conjugality was very different. Today, you see that
very
strong
different
kind of idea of couple
had
culture.
a strong kind of ascetic sensibility.
Yes, which is not there today. And so
maybe it is there, we don't see it so much.
Because this is what we were discussing yesterday, that the pressure for your generation wasn't maybe that strong, or it seemed like a very easy thing to do.
Actually, now it wasn't, because we were also a transitional generation. Remember, the Naxalite movement was over. Okay. We were the generation that saw the emergency. I was in second year BA. When I came to MA, several of our teachers had been in prison and they'd come out. Right? So it actually wasn't easy at all. It's just that you thought this was part. See, in one way it was easier. You had the authority, and the mode of being was the resistance to authority, though I was never a bus burning type myself, but they're all up, so there was a sense. While now that has gone. See, the models are success models.
Yes.
So they're far more conventional, far more difficult to cope with. Right. Because everyone should be happy, everyone should be prosperous, everyone should be successful, and it doesn't happen that way.
I think that is what is important, that success model that you
and you are an individual now. You're not part of a class or a group or
community,
something. Or a family or something.
Yes.
It's much more difficult.
And I think couple culture is part of their success. It's like a large part of the success
and it can lead to great insecurity.
Yes.
Actually, there was something to be said that if you can, disperse that whatever emotions you have amongst a group, whether these are friends or something. And I guess there are people who have that as well. I can't say it's not that everyone doesn't. But the ones who are insecure, I know amongst the MA and PA, the ones who are insecure are the ones who have these kinds of issues
So that
with
means
family and
yeah.
relationship.
So there is a change from your generation to, let's say,
Yeah.
mine, or
Yeah.
let's say my students and our students.
Though I have any number of students who still come from very large families, who have relatives dropping over all the time. And some of these are interfaith marriages, right? Hindu, Muslim, and so on. People of maybe even just a little younger than me, and who have large circles of friends. So I have those students as well, who don't have these issues, but you have others. So again, maybe this is another kind of transitional generation. You have both. And sometimes friends are your greatest support.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
With many of my students, I've seen that.
So what is your network then of support?
Oh, support. I guess still family. And I realized because my mother passed away in January, and frankly, there was nobody there except me. But I mean, strangers came to help, and or people whom I thought were strangers, and a lot of other people as well, including people from my school who hadn't been in touch with for at least 50 years.
Wow.
Or, well, somebody from 40 years, and she got to know, and they came for her prayer meeting, and we've been. So it's amazing, actually, if you have trust that people will be there when
They
you
will
need them.
come. Yeah.
Even in the Netherlands, when I was again quite ill, it was these old ladies and others who stood by you. So there will be people who come forward.
I like the point that you raise of trust.
Yes, so you have trust. Because my mother died at 2 in the morning. It was in the middle of the cold wave in Delhi, January 7th, and her doctor was in Calcutta. I was really scared about what to do because I didn't want it to become a police case. Her doctor wasn't there. I phoned her chemist, and the paramedic told me what to do. So I phoned this hospital whom I've never been there, didn't know. And he said, phone the owners. Because the hospital didn't, and the owners phoned back and said, you just phone them now, a doctor will come and certify.
And you were alone with your mother?
I was alone with my mother. Can you believe it? So these are strangers.
Absolutely.
So see, people do help.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think that's most important for us to remember, that it's not just the family,
or friends, because nobody
come from
made
anywhere.
My brother had to come from Noida, so he was on his way. And by the time he landed, the doctors were leaving. So it was good he met them. But and it can happen that by chance people want to be there, but by chance you can't. And I mean, my mother was lingering for a long time. Nobody knew. And a doctor was back the next day. But
just that moment.
Yeah, but it happened. It worked out. So actually, it was everything worked out.
And last point, now that you're aging, is there any specific challenge being single that you want to tell us about?
Well, yes, not of being single, of living on your own, is that I have rheumatoid arthritis, and I'm an old patient of rheumatoid arthritis. So little things you have to adapt to. Like, even things like holding a heavier glass, turning a doorknob,
turning the key,
can I lift the suitcase?
Yes.
I haven't been out for 4 years anywhere.
So how do you manage those things since you're living alone?
See, so you have to adapt. I do my exercises and stuff. Certain things I can't do, like bottle. I get, if it's medicine, I tell the chemist, open it for me. And Coca-Cola bottles, I get someone to do it while they're there. So see, you have to think in advance. So you adapt. And it could happen to anyone. The point is, somebody may not be at home. So then, you get the shopkeepers or maybe the chowkidar, somebody.
That's fascinating.
To help what to do.
Yeah.
It could happen to anyone.
Absolutely.
There will be times when you are on your own. So
and so that's something that you have been able to kind of adapt to.
And because it is a progressive condition, so you're constantly having to readapt.
Right.
But till now it's been okay.
So in terms of the medical system, now that you have this, have they understood that there's nobody in the house to do things for you? Right? Because they often assume, doctors assume that there is somebody to do stuff for you.
Yeah, well, no, I have to say, because I've managed pretty well till now, so they haven't bent their minds to it as yet. But where I will be staying, there are a lot of aging people. I'll be amongst the younger ones. So I think there will be.
You'll be the younger one.
Well, see, now it's the second generation.
Right.
So all our parents were in the armed
Mm,
forces. So,
mm.
so now we are the second generation. So I would have seen many of them earlier when we were all younger. So we'll be there for each other, I
There's a
guess, when
community.
required,
Yeah.
yes. And I think the office is also quite aware.
Mm.
So yeah, I'm not worried about that. It won't
That's
be an issue.
interesting. That's
And
really
even where I am now, where my
Mm.
mother passed away, the neighbors know. I mean, they've been, of course, the first thing, why didn't you tell us? So I said 2 in the morning.
Yeah.
And they were very upset that I hadn't told them. So
Mm.
I said, look, I mean, you have to understand. I
Mm.
mean, I had to think about what to do
Mm. Mm.
next. And
Absolutely.
he seemed to be the logical choice, the paramedic.
Absolutely.
Huh.
Yeah. Yeah.
So fine. So that, and then of course, a lot of people helped, I have to
Mm.
say after that.
Mm. Mm.
So I think people are genuinely kind.
Mm. I think that's
So
the key
I
takeaway.
think, yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Any-
it's not such a difficult world out there.
No.
Yes, there are, but
Yeah.
I mean, it's not as bad
As it's
some-
made out to be.
as it. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
it isn't. It
It
isn't.
isn't. Any last thought you want to leave us? Any kind of advice or something
You
for
know,
us?
be yourself
Yes.
and don't worry. Things
Mm.
will have a tendency to work themselves out.
Mm.
There will be bad moments, but when you're living through them, they never seem as bad
Mm.
as you might have anticipated
True.
or as maybe you remember.
True.
Right?
True.
So they're never as bad when you're living through them, and you're going to be with students for a long, large part of your life. So you will be very much in the thick of things.
Yeah.
So I think, and you should keep active, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, in
Yeah.
whatever you're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, you are also a
Yes.
scholar, so keep doing
Yes.
research,
Right.
keep giving
Yeah.
lectures and
Yeah.
teaching as long as you can.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think for everyone, not
Yeah,
just
not
for
for me,
single
yeah,
people,
yeah.
but yeah, I know because a
Mm.
lot of people, including my old supervisor, she phoned me from America and said, Roma, you have to promise me. I know you are very content alone, but go out and talk to people. So I said, I promise to do that because frankly, it comes naturally to me to be
Yeah.
happily doing my own thing at home. But she said, you must make that effort. So I guess when I go back, I have to start.
Yeah.
Because they will feel hurt if I don't.
Yeah,
so I should at least
yeah.
they will understand. But so I guess I mean that will be an effort because it would I would far easier not to.
Yeah.
And I'd be quite happy not. But she said, I know you will be, but you have to. So promise me. So I said yes, I will do so. So yeah. And I have to say, both my aunts from my father and mother's side, they've been phoning me regularly. They think that you come and still. I said, yeah, I will, but let me, do my shifting and settle everything. Then because I don't like taking holidays that often. Because it's a big disruption, and you always have things you have to finish and so on. So yeah, otherwise things are fine.
Yeah. Thank you so much
Pleasure.
for all that conversation, for some of the ideas to sum it up, the questions of trust,
Yeah,
questions
I think
of,
that's very
I
important.
think different socialities
Yeah,
of
yeah,
having a
yeah.
strong personality,
Yeah,
and I love the
yeah.
idea of being eccentric because I think that works for me.
Yeah.
So I think these are some of the interesting points.
If
that
you
we
go
take
back
away.
to Parsons, and
Yes.
you probably hated him like everyone else, but one of the generalized media of exchange, that is his last thought in his mature period, was trust. Money, power, trust.
Right.
There are three kinds of media that circulate that establish sociality within the system. Trust is one of those.
Let's not forget that.
Yeah, so it was said a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and I think we'll stop at that lovely
Yeah,
thought.
yeah. Thank you.